Hey guys, Brent Hull Build Show. The arts and crafts movement, when did it start? Where did it start? We're going to talk about it today on the Build Show. The arts and crafts movement, we're actually going to study the UK version of it because it influences the American version of it. So we're going to do two videos. This is part one, really dealing with the arts and crafts side in Europe and in the UK. Now, you know I just went on that Lutyens tour. Lutyens was an English architect that was very influential. He started out in the arts and crafts era, okay? So realize that the arts and crafts era is not just arts and crafts architecture, it's a whole arts movement, okay? It's a rejection of over-industrialized, industrial revolutionized life, okay? Where everything was machine made, the man was losing his soul to the machine. One of the quotes I'd heard was novelty without beauty. What a great thing that makes sense for us today. There's a lot of houses being built that are novelties but without beauty. And so there was a whole movement, and it went from textiles to pottery to architecture to furniture. Gustav Stickley obviously was very influential by that. So in the UK, it starts earlier because their industrial revolution starts a little bit earlier, or a little more powerfully, maybe I should say. And so it starts with a guy named A.W. Pugin, okay? Pugin was a Gothic revival nut. He actually was the one who was the architectural influence for Westminster, which is a Gothic revival building, 1834, I think, but it was all part of that Gothic revival movement, and it was his influence that this is a very British way to be building, that the Gothic was the best period of construction because you had fine craftsmanship, because you had real materials. And this is where they start talking about truth and honesty in buildings, because they felt things were being cheap and fake. Next major figure was a guy named John Ruskin. You guys may have heard of John Ruskin. We actually put his quote, okay, in a beautiful frame because this is really one of the ideals of how we build. When we build, let us think that we build forever. You heard me talking about building for 100 years, no longer building disposably, right? John Ruskin was saying this in the 1850s, 1860s. Let it not be for present delight nor present use alone. Let it be such work as our descendants will thank us for. And let us think as we lay stone on stone that a time is to come when those stones will be held sacred because our hands have touched them. And that men will say, as they look upon the labor and wrought substance of them, see, this our Father did for us. John Ruskin. So one reason why I think the arts and crafts appeals to us today is because we've kind of gone through that McMansion era where houses are cheap, houses are becoming disposable. It's always about the cheapest product because no one can afford housing, and we end up with ugly, ugly houses. And so John Ruskin was a writer and a thinker. He wrote books called like The Seven Lamps of Architecture, and he was writing and he was a social commentator. And so he was talking about beauty and honesty and building things to last, right? Finally, there was William Morris, and everybody I think has heard of William Morris, famous for his papers and his beautiful designs, and he worked with a number of people. They all start to begin to know each other. William Morris was a great designer. He lived in a house called the Red House, one of his first houses by one of the architects we studied on our tour, Philip Webb. Now, there was a whole group of English architects that practiced in the arts and crafts style. And so that was what we were studying on this trip. Philip Webb was one of them. We looked at one of his houses. C.F.A. Voysey, okay, was another one. You'll see his house. And then, of course, Edwin Lutyens. And Lutyens was working in this style during this period because of these ideals. So those three, Pugin, Ruskin, and Morris, all developed these ideals, and they write about beauty and honesty and texture and just wonder in architecture. And so it begins to get practiced by these guys that all knew each other. So Philip Webb was one of them. We looked at one of his houses called Stanton House. One of his later houses, Red House, is a house I actually visited years ago. It's really beautiful. Look at what Stanton was doing in this house. Look at these crazy mantles. Look at the paneling on the walls, this simplicity, yet there's beauty here, and these arches and the different use of stone. Really, he's capturing that arts and crafts ideal. Another guy was that Voysey I talked about. We looked at Follies. We looked at some of his gardens and things like that. But his house on the inside outside, and that same kind of rough paneling on the inside. Not super ornamented, but the beauty of the material coming through, right? It's a modern style. So think about the Victorian era and everything that was going on. These guys were really expressing things in a very modern way. And so this is, some people think this is the first modern movement. Certainly Edmund Lutyens practices parts of this arts and crafts ideal, and his houses are this romantic return to the English Tudor houses, okay? So one of his houses, there's a 15th century house that he added onto, and quite frankly, it's very difficult to see where that side and this side are two differently. He really practiced the ideals with the windows and the lights and the stairs and all the different ways he was building. The gardens were very important to this style. But if you look at the ironwork, you look at the stonework, you look at the pegged detailing, there was an expression of this arts and crafts ideal that was practiced by these guys that was beautiful, and it was lovely to see. One of the things that's fascinating for me, particularly when I was studying details, and one of the things I travel and talk about, and reason why I do it is because I get inspired by looking at the way they built. But I went to the Gamble House when I was out in California to see my daughter perform. They went to the Gamble House very excited because they wanted to go. The architectural details that Green and Green were building with, for instance, the timbers that came together and the keys that held these timbers together, I saw in England in a Voysey house where it was a scarf joint brought together with a key held up by a column. That was very similar way of expressing building, right? Very similar way of being inspired by the past, the timber frames and how those were built, and yet expressing them in a very new way. And so you can see that if you look at Philip Webb's house and the use of his brickwork, and you look at the Roby house and what Frank Lloyd Wright was doing. If you look at the entrance to the Lutyens house with this stonework, you see that these similarities between the two. You see them both being inspired by the past, a gauged brick arch opening, timber framing, joinery, and how things are put together. The Lutyens houses look like very early English country houses. And so there's an Americanized version of the arts and crafts. There's a UK version of the arts and crafts. There's a lot of similarities. There's also a lot of differences. And so, their houses you would never look at and go, oh, that's an arts and crafts house. You might look at it and say it's Art Nouveau, or you might look at it and say it's early modernism, but you don't really look at it the way we look at our arts and crafts houses of Stickley, Frank Lloyd Wright, of Green and Green. So one of the things you'll notice about the English version of it is there is I've said that modernism is kind of this long linear thing, and classicism is a tall uplifting thing. You'll see it sometimes when I'm talking about windows, that I want to take that rectangle and turn it up if you're trying to build a traditional house in the window pane. Well, you do see that horizontality. If you look at that Voysey house, there's this clear pediment that goes up, then this tall pitched roof, but there's this banding that you'll see that's a horizontal band of windows that kind of captures that, and the reason people call it early modernism, because you start to see that horizontality and that lengthening that you see. If you look at the fireplace at the Green and Green house, that inglenook is very long and linear. Those lines that stretch out, and there's a horizontality there too. So fun details for me to see, fun details for me to learn, seeing how, and realize the UK version came first. They're doing their stuff in the 1890s and early 1900s. Our houses aren't really until the early 1900s. So they're 10 or 15 years ahead of us as far as what they're being inspired by. We pick up what William Morris was saying, we pick up what Ruskin was saying, and Pugin, and we are inspired by those same things. Gustav Stickley, as I remember from my reading, he actually went to England, was inspired by a lot of things that were done there, and came back and began to write about it, much like William Morris and Ruskin were writing about it in his magazine called The Craftsman. So a lot of similarities, a lot of cool things to learn and see. There's a brief, quick history, some guys you can look up and kind of look into their work and see what the differences are. I'm Brent Hull. Thanks for watching.